Good evening. Boy, what a difficult act to follow. Wow. But they did introduce the idea of plants and the critical role of plants in bringing energy into our ecosystem and into our own bodies. And they also brought up the fact that the burning of fossil fuels that began with the Industrial Revolution really created the problem that I want to talk about tonight. But before I start, I wanted to really express my gratitude to the organizers of this amazing festival for the invitation to speak and for your generous hospitality, and to all the organizers that have made this festival what it has been. So thank you very much. All right, so I would like to speak about plants in our changing world, but I decided to add a subtitle to this talk, Muddy Boots to Microscopes, and I hope by the end of my talk you'll understand what I mean by this expression. So back to the effect that the burning of fossil fuels is having on our globe. If you were here or anywhere in Europe this summer, you know that our world is getting very hot. This graphic shows the temperatures in July of this year, and the colors show the temperature. The warmer the color, the hotter the temperature. And you can see that maybe it wasn't quite so hot here on the coast, but elsewhere in Spain, it was really hot. And we also know that climate change is really contributing to the increasing frequencies of these mega heat waves here in Europe and even in the United States where I live. And so these heat waves are just one expression of the increasing temperatures that we're finding across our globe. These two graphics show the projected increase in global temperatures predicted for the end of this century based on two different models. So this model shows the predictions if we really cap down on our release of greenhouse gases. And this, come back. Okay. That model shows the predictions if we continue to emit greenhouse gases at the rate that we're doing now. And you can see that even in the best case scenario, our globe will be warmer by at least several degrees. Again, the warmer the temperature on the graphic, the greater the increase in temperature. The other thing I want you to see from this graphic is that the temperature increase is more dramatic towards the polar regions of our globe. So not only are the temperatures getting warmer, but the warm season is increasing. So summer or spring, warm spring temperatures are coming earlier, and the warm temperatures of summer are leaving later with an increase in the total, what we call the growing season length. And again, the graphic is showing the projected increase in this period from spring to autumn, projected for the near future across Europe. Again, the warmer colors, the greater the increase. And you can see that this period is in fact getting warmer, getting longer. Spring is arriving earlier. August is lasting longer. And it's the consequences of this increase length of time from the spring to the autumn that I want to talk about. So let's talk with the spring. What images come to your mind when you think of spring? So close your eyes for a minute and think spring. What do you see? Yay! That's what I think when I think of spring. I think of beautiful spring flowers. So let's do it again. This one's harder. What images come to mind when you think of autumn? Yeah, it's sort of more complicated, changing leaves, changing colors. But one thing I think of is harvesting fruit. Where I come from in the northeast of the United States, when the weather gets cool and the days get short, we go apple picking. So that's what autumn means to me. So, but how do plants know it's spring? How do they know when to flower? How do they know when it's autumn? How do they know when to fruit? And getting this wrong has pretty grave consequences if you're a plant. If you flower too early, you risk late freezes, even late snows. And when this happens, the flowers die, there's no fruit, There's no reproduction for the plant. Plants that flower at the wrong time also risk that their pollinators may not be out. Again, no pollen movement, no reproduction, no fruit, no future for that plant. So it's critical that plants get this timing right. And so plant biologists or biologists in general use this term phenology to refer to the seasonal timing of these kinds of stages, that is, things like flowering and fruiting. And so plants actually know when it's spring and when it's autumn based on cues from the environment. So phenology depends on the environment. But our environment is changing. It's changing rapidly. And so what's happening to plants as the environment changes? Well, we know, actually, that changes in phenology, that is, changes particularly in flowering, have been among the most obvious and thoroughly documented biological responses to the climate warming of the last 150 years. And so I can stand up here and tell you with great confidence that flowering time is changing, and changing quite dramatically. But how do I know? I haven't been here for 150 years. Well, the data that's being uncovered about flowering and fruiting is really remarkable. For example, let's ask the question, how do we know, right? How do I know that flowering time is changing? Now on to the remarkable data. So the Japanese have been recording what time of year the cherry blossoms come out for over 1,300 years. And so we know that, based on these data, that the cherry trees are flowering quite a bit earlier now than they have historically. Closer to home, here in Europe, the timing of the grape harvest has been recorded for over 670 years. And we know that the timing that the grapes are ripe is also changing quite remarkably. Scientists have also contributed their own very lengthy record. So an herbarium is essentially a plant museum. And so plant biologists have been going out for hundreds and hundreds of years and collecting plants. When they collect them, they press them dry, and they mount them on a sheet of paper, and that's what I'm showing you here. And they also, on that sheet of paper, include a label that tells not only what that plant is, but also where it was collected and when it was collected. So I can go to an herbarium and pull out a sheet of a plant that was collected 250 years ago. And if I look closely, I can see that that plant was in flower when it was collected, and I know where it was collected and when it was collected, so I can look at what that plant is doing now and know a lot about the changing flowering phenology over that several hundred year time span. And so based on historical data sets, but also many, many studies of these herbarium specimens, we have ample evidence from multiple sources from all around the globe that shows us that many plant species are flowering earlier in the season in response to these warming temperatures. But if you look at these data carefully, especially the herbarium data, so this is sort of what scientists are at first really excited about. But if you start looking at the data really carefully, you see that not all plants are flowering earlier. Many plants are actually flowering later in warmer years, which is really surprising. How can temperature, the same environmental cue, cause some plants to flower early and some plants to flower late? We actually have no known mechanism to explain this, to explain how one cue can cause two really, really different responses. So, well, what do we really know about the relationship between temperature and flowering? Most phenology research, so research that considers the effects of temperature on flowering, relies on correlation. That is, we ask, when did it flower? That's pretty easy to observe. And then we ask, what was the temperature just before that plant flowered? Also easy enough to measure. And we ask about the relationship. When it's warm, do plants flower early? But the problem with this approach is that flowering, the appearance of a flower, is just one single brief phase in the very lengthy period of development of a flower that often begins 1 or more years before you ever see those flowers. So for example, when this amazing Magnolia stellata bursts into bloom in the early spring, and we see each of its exquisite flowers, how long did it take to make that flower? So for example, you see a baby, right? This baby bursts forth into your life, but how long did it take to make that baby? 9 months, right? How long did it take to make that flower? What do you think? 3 days? 2 weeks? A month? You got it. It takes nearly a year to make most flowers. So for example, that magnolia flower began developing the summer before, and it went through most of its stages of development and then spent the winter tucked inside this beautiful, beautiful fuzzy bud, protected from the winter, almost fully formed, and then when spring comes, it bursts forth into flower. And so this phenomenon where flower development begins 1 or more years before that flower actually opens is called preformation. And preformation is characteristic of most plants, actually. It's characteristic of temperate forest trees, so most of the trees around here, shrubs, herbaceous perennials, and it's ubiquitous for plants that grow at high elevations or far high latitudes. And so preformation is really characteristic of any plant except tropical plants. And so I've put this cartoon up to explain this maybe a little more clearly. So this arrow represents this really a 2-year-long period of flower development. So it starts here, and it proceeds for most of a growing season, starts in the spring, goes on through the summer, but it's occurring all tucked inside that bud where we can't see it. And then comes winter, and so the plant and the developing flower go dormant. They wait out the winter. The second year comes, the flower starts developing again, and within a very short period, actually, you see it in flower. And so, again, most research on phenology looks at this, asks what the temperature was here, and tries to find some sort of relationship between the temperature here and the appearance of this flower. But that's really ignoring all of this development that goes on in the preceding year. And it turns out that we actually know very little about this part of the development of a flower, which is astonishing to me, right? We just don't know much about that development, and we know nothing about what temperature is doing during this first year of development. So if we want to study the development of flowers during this preformation period, where does it occur? Where does flower development take place? Well, if you look up into the canopy of a tree, for example, if you look closely, well, if you look up into the canopy of a tree, you'll see lots of branches, right? And if you look at the tips of all of the branches, they have twigs, and each of those twigs ends like this in these little hard buds. And so this is a close-up of what you see here. And so these are, this very technical term, bud, that structure is protecting all of the structures that will actually function next year as they develop. So this is where development occurs. And as you might guess, those structures are really small. And so in order to study their development, we can't just go outside and look and say, oh, it's flowering. We have to collect those buds, bring them into the lab, and look at them with microscopes, including a scanning electron microscope, which allows us to get very high magnification views. All right, so I'm arguing to you that in order to better understand the effects of temperature on flowering phenology, that is, when we actually see a flower, we need to look at this whole period of development and understand what's going on. So we're going to study development as a key to understanding changes in flowering. Okay, well, if I want to study development in respect to temperature change, then I have to go where climate is changing most rapidly. And so I decided to go, as I told you earlier, the climate is changing most rapidly at northern latitudes, and so that's where I went. Where I'm working is an area called the boreal forest, or taiga. The boreal forest is a nearly continuous band of forest that completely encircles the northern hemisphere. It's actually the world's largest biome, larger actually than the tropical rainforest, which we hear actually quite a lot about in the news. Has anybody ever heard of the boreal forest? It doesn't get much attention. But there I went. There I went. There I went. Let's go back. Okay, so I went north to study climate change. I went to the state of Alaska, which is part of the United States, but way up here at the northern latitudes. And this is the state of Alaska, and I was working in Fairbanks, which is in interior Alaska, where the temperatures, the average temperature, is already up by 1.4 degrees, and the growing season length, that is the number of days from when the snow melts to when it snows again, is up by 45%. So really, really radical changes are going on in Alaska. And this is what the area looks like around Fairbanks, the boreal forest. And so in 2016, I went to Alaska to look around the boreal forest and to consider this problem of developmental responses to climate change. And so there I am, thinking about this. What do I know about Alaska? The first thing that comes to mind is all the wild animals that live in Alaska. Moose, right? These animals are enormous, 1.5 to 2 meters tall at their shoulder, 380 to 680 kilos, and they're well known to charge people when they're surprised. So then the next thing that comes to my mind, grizzly bears. Bigger, scarier, right? When these are up on their hind legs, a couple of meters tall, 360 kilos, really scary. Fortunately, we never saw either one of them. So the other thing that Alaska is really well known for, mosquitoes. And boy, did we see mosquitoes. Oh my goodness, the mosquitoes. But I was prepared for the mosquitoes, and I brought, the spray that you can put all over you, and I still got bit, but it was okay. The thing I didn't expect, mud. Oh, the mud. So Alaska, the soil is frozen all winter, and then it snows, and the snow melts, and the water doesn't have anywhere to go. And so as the soil begins to thaw, it just makes mud, and the mud is slippery and slimy and everywhere, and it will suck your boots off if you're not careful. This is just like mud. But anyway, I dealt with it. So again, think of me there in Alaska. So now I'm up on a bluff, looking out over where I want to work. And this is early spring. You can see it's sort of brown because it hasn't really greened up yet at all. Okay, and I'm thinking, okay, so here's my question, right? How will warming temperatures affect plant development? Okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to do an experiment. What's the experiment? Warm the plants, ask how they respond. This is the middle of nowhere. How do you do an experiment in the middle of nowhere? How do you warm plants in the middle of nowhere? So thought about it again, talked it over with my collaborator. So how are we going to warm the plants? Well, we need something that's portable, because this is the middle of nowhere, and we have to get whatever we're going to use out there. We need something that's lightweight, because whatever we're going to use, we have to carry it out there. We need something sturdy, because this is the middle of nowhere, and it has to sit out there for the entire season. And it can't require electricity, because this is the middle of nowhere. And so we got really friendly with the people at the hardware store as we're trying to build something that's going to work for us. And in the end, we ended up ordering these little greenhouses from the internet. So you can just go on and order them up. And we had to do a little bit of modification. We had to cut the bottoms out of them so we could put them over the plants. We had to cut the tops out of them so that they didn't get too warm. But we were finally able to construct something that would pretty predictably warm the air inside those little greenhouses by about 2 degrees C. So we did have a little bit of technology. So we had these instruments out at our field sites as well that could record light and temperature, both inside the greenhouses and in our adjacent sites that weren't warmed. So we order up all these greenhouses from the internet. We spent a couple of, and this is an experiment. It has to be replicated. So we had, I think, 120 greenhouses, and so this is me and my colleagues in putting together, assembling our greenhouses. And so off we went. We had a four-wheel drive vehicle to get us close to our sites, but the mud was even too much for a four-wheel drive truck. So mostly we carried our little greenhouses, and we carried our little greenhouses, and we carried them, and we carried them, and we carried them till we finally reached the sites that we had chosen to do our experiments. And there we set them up. And so this is, again, very early in the season, before any of the plants have started to do anything. They're all still dormant, putting out our greenhouses. And we worked in 2 different areas of the boreal forest. And so this is called the black spruce forest. And I put forest in quote marks because you can see from the size of these trees that it's not really much of a forest. We also worked in the birch forest, which is a little bit more foresty looking. So we worked with a variety of different species. They were chosen because they had very different growth forms, they had very different flowering times, they had very different roles in the boreal forest ecosystem. So we wanted to get a broad representative range of plants. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about one of them. So I'm going to tell you about this plant. The scientific name is Vaccinium vitusidea. Its common name is cranberry or lingonberry. And this is a really interesting plant because it has a very wide distribution. It's distributed throughout the boreal forest, so all the way around the top of the globe. It's very common. It's a very important food source for animals, both the animals that pollinate it, so those animals get the nectar and the pollen, but also for animals that eat the berries. Many different animals eat the berries, but also those berries are important sources of food for Native Alaskans and form a really important part of their culture. Native Alaskans have their favorite cranberry picking areas and they guard that information quite furiously. Okay, so we would go out and collect plants throughout the growing season from all of our different research sites and then bring them back into the laboratory to begin to study development. At the same time, we were collecting phenology data, asking when each of these species began to flower, when does it fruit, and so forth. And so this is what a little twig of a cranberry would look like when we would go out at the beginning of the season to collect. So for example, when we were out in May of 2018, the shoot would look like this. And this is what we're after. This is that little bud where I told you development occurs. And so in 2018, we're collecting this bit in order to look at the generation of flowers that won't be born, they won't emerge until 2019. Okay, so we take this in the lab and ask, how do the flowers develop and where do they come from? Okay, so this is the beginning. We begin to sort of pull all of those leaves away. These are the scars that are left behind as we pull those little leaves away. And right here, where that leaf meets the stem, can you see that little mound of tissue? That's the very earliest sign, the very earliest stage of a flower. And it's tiny. You can see it's about 1/10 of a millimeter. And so this will turn into that cranberry flower. So this is June. right, pretty early in the summer. We go back, so we're going back and collecting periodically, and so I'll just show you a few more pictures of what it looks like. So this is a young flower, kind of close up. This is a petal that's coming out right at the side of that flower. Gets a little bigger, so this is a slightly older petal here. This is the whole flower. And so these are the kinds of stages that you might see in early July. And then we continue to go out and collect. And then later in the season, maybe August to September, you get something like this. So part of the flower has been pulled away. These are the reproductive organs. So it's pretty well developed by the end of September. And at this point, the plant goes dormant. This little flower sits there the whole Alaskan winter long. And then come May, it starts developing again, goes through a few more processes of development. And finally in June, nearly 1 year after we saw that little mound of tissue there, we have a mature flower. So it really does cover this 2-year period from June to June. Okay, so we have an idea, a sketch of what development looks like, but I told you we've also been looking at phenology. And so we also found out that, for example, the plants that were warmed in 2017, so they were growing in these greenhouses. So if we had the greenhouses on them in 2017, they actually flowered later in 2018. So the effect of warming was on those early stages of development, but we don't see the manifestation of that result until a full year later. And so this is consistent then with the hypothesis that I started out with. If we want to know what's affecting when that flower comes out, we really need to pay attention to what's going on inside those little buds and understand how temperature is affecting those processes. So I really have to go back to all of the material that we've collected and understand in detail the differences in development between the plants that were grown in the greenhouses and the plants that were grown outside of the greenhouses. And so we have the phenology data, we know that we've had an effect, but we're still working, we still have a long ways to go in actually analyzing the developmental data. But this is the nature of science, isn't it? You get one answer, and it just makes another question, and you get that answer, and it makes another question. And so you keep moving through science. Science is a process that takes us from question to answer to question to answer. And it's really an exciting and fantastic journey. So if you think about what I've told you about this afternoon, just 4 years ago, I had an idea or a question. I just noticed that the climate change models really didn't explain many plant species' responses. They just weren't correct. They didn't give me the explanation I wanted. So 3 years ago, I was able to convince a government funding agency that this was a question worth pursuing. So thank you, National Science Foundation. And then 2 years ago, I went to Alaska to start this project. Now, I have tons of data that still have to be interpreted. But my goal is really to create a new model for how plants respond to climate change. And so 2 years from now, I'll be able to tell you why some plants in a warming world flower later. And this idea of creating a new model, well, let me wait before I tell you that. So remember, I told you that we studied a variety of species, right, that have many different characteristics, with the goal, although we're interested in those particular species, they're very interesting, but our real goal is to be able to generalize, to move from the things we find out about this range of species to actually predict what might happen in the future and to predict how other plants might respond, how the oak trees out on the hills here might respond to climate change. Even if we've never studied them, can we actually predict? And so it's important to create these new and accurate models, because without the right models for how plants will respond to increasing temperatures, we will not ever be able to accurately predict the consequences of climate change. And so understanding plants and their very, very basic biology is critical for understanding and predicting the consequences of global change. And understanding the effects of global change on plants is really critical for our survival. And as was shown so entertainingly by the performers, plants are the source of our oxygen. Plants are the source of our food. Plants are the source of energy that comes into the ecosystem. So we ignore them at our peril. And so it's important to ask and answer the question, how will plants fare in our changing world? And this is going to take a lot of work, and a lot of work from many different scientists, ranging from those out in the field with their muddy boots to those in the laboratory with their microscopes. And we really need to answer this question so we can answer a question we also care about: how will we fare in a changing world? So thank you very much.